Malachi Freeman came to this town seeking peace. A quiet man. A builder of boats. And the only black man to own a piece of its coveted shoreline, but his new beginning was about to be challenged. They came to his home with fake badges and a manufactured warrant. They came to enforce rules that didn't exist. They came to put a black man in his place. They thought they knew who they were dealing with. They were wrong. Their fatal mistake wasn't just breaking the law. It was choosing the wrong man to break. What happens when bullies who pretend to be cops come face to face with a former Navy SEAL? This is a story of quiet strength against loud injustice. If you believe that a person's true character is revealed under pressure, let us know in the comments. And be sure to subscribe to Dipucator Stories for more. Let's get into the story. A summons on free land. They say a black man is never truly free, not even on the land he bought with his own blood and sweat. Malachi Freeman hadn't believed that. Not until today. The air in the workshop always smelled of cedar and the sea. It was a scent of peace, of creation. Mal ran a calloused hand over the smooth, curved hull of a kayak, a vessel born from his patience. It was a quiet life, a deliberate life. Then, the quiet broke. 3 men stood in the wide doorway, their shapes blocking the misty gray light of the Port Salvation morning. They wore cheap navy blue shirts, the kind you buy in a 3-pack. An awkwardly embroidered patch on the chest read, HOA Enforcement Unit. The man in the middle, Leland Croft, was built soft by authority, not labor. He held a clipboard like a shield. Freeman, he said. Not a question, but a statement. We've had complaints. You're not following community rules. And Malachi didn't move. His eyes, weary from a life of things seen, took them in. The cheap shirts, the man on the right, shifting his weight from foot to foot. The younger man on the left, trying to look tough, but his gaze kept darting towards their car. Always look for the exit. Mal thought. The nervous ones always do. There's no homeowners association on this cove. Mal said. His voice was low, calm. The sound of stones settling at the bottom of a deep river. Leland Croft let out a short, unpleasant laugh. There is now, things change. Maybe if you'd attend the meetings, you'd know. His tone was condescending, edged with an unspoken accusation. You don't belong here. You don't get to be ignorant. He thrust the clipboard forward. It held a single sheet of paper, a document printed to look official, a fake summons. For a fake court, we have a warrant to take you into custody for non-compliance. Arrest. The word hung in the cedar-scented air. This is my land, Mal said softly. Not anymore if you don't follow the rules. Leland snapped, his patience gone. The pretense was over. This was about power. He gave a nod to the man on his right. Cuff him. The man stepped forward, pulling out a pair of black zip-tie cuffs. He moved with the clumsy confidence of a bully who'd never been challenged. And that's when the man building the boat disappeared. Malachi Freeman didn't tense up. He didn't raise his voice. He simply changed. The weariness in his shoulders didn't vanish. It settled, hardening into a foundation. His center of gravity lowered, a fractional shift no ordinary eye would notice. His hands, which had been resting on the kayak's hull, dropped to his sides, loose but ready. His gaze, which had been tired, went flat, vacant, and analytical. He wasn't looking at their faces anymore. He was looking at throats, knees, the angle of a wrist, the distance to the door. He spoke, and his voice was no longer the sound of settling stones. It was the sound of grinding ice. Those zip-tie cuffs, he said, almost conversationally. Low-grade polymer, prone to snapping in the cold. The kind the insurgents used to use in Yemen. Silence. The younger man, the nervous one, took an involuntary step back. His face went pale. That wasn't the knowledge of a boat builder. That wasn't a detail a civilian would know. He looked at Mal's stance, at his empty, watching eyes, and he saw a ghost. Leland, blinded by his own arrogance, didn't see it. You think you're smart? He sneered. Stepping closer. You're just a troublemaker. Who the hell do you think you are? Malachi's gaze finally locked onto Leland's. For the first time, he let the man see what was behind his eyes. It was a deep, cold darkness. Petty Officer First Class. Malachi Freeman said, each word clear and heavy. Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Retired. M. The name didn't register with Leland, but the younger man gasped. He knew what that meant. DevCrew. SEAL Team 6. From the road. A faint sound grew steadily louder. Asireu. Leland's face, which had been a mask of smug authority, crumbled. Panic flashed in his eyes. You called the cops? Malachi almost smiled. I didn't have to. Sheriff Elias Thorne's cruiser skidded to a halt in the gravel outside. Leland and his men froze. Caught in the sudden wash of flashing blue and red lights, they hadn't come to arrest a quiet black man. They had walked into a cage with a sleeping lion and tried to put a leash on him. Hours later, the silence had returned. But it was different now. It was heavier. Mal stood alone in the workshop. The scent of cedar now mingled with the sour memory of fear. Theirs, not his. He looked down at his hands. Hands that knew how to follow the grain of the wood, how to create beauty and purpose from a dead tree. Hands that also knew, with an instinct he could never erase, a dozen ways to end a life. The cold wasn't the damp chill of the Pacific. It was the dry, biting cold of the Hindu Kush Mountains. The memory came unbidden, as it always did. A flash of white snow against a black sky, the muffled crack of a sniper's rifle, the grunt of surprise and pain beside him, his best friend, Marcus Vance, falling into the snow, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Mal had dragged him behind cover, pressing his hands against the wound. But he knew. They both knew. Marcus had grabbed his arm, his grip surprisingly strong. His last words weren't about the fight, or about God, or about fear. They were a whisper, a final, disparity mission. Nora, he'd choked out, blood on his lips. Tell her, I tried. I will lemmer. Malachi had survived, but he had failed that mission. He had never delivered the message. He had never been able to face Nora, Marcus's wife. The guilt was a weight heavier than any gear he had ever carried. It was why he was here, in this quiet corner of the world, trying to build something that wasn't meant for destruction. He walked to the doorway of his workshop and looked out. Across the dark, still water of the cove, a single, warm light shone through the thick Washington mist. It was a beacon in the gloom, the harbor light. Nora's coffee shop, and the weight in his chest grew heavier still. Roots of hemlock. The sting of failure tasted like rust and cheap coffee. Leland Croft sat in his cramped office above the old fish market, the air thick with the smell of stale paper and resentment. The retreat from Freeman's workshop hadn't been a withdrawal. It had been a humiliation. His knuckles were still white from gripping the steering wheel. The image of that man, that quiet, unbreakable man, burned into his mind. He stared at the large, faded map of Port Salvation tacked to the wall. It was a relic from his father's time, crisscrossed with pencil lines marking the boundaries of what once was Croft land, nearly a third of the peninsula, before the bad investments, before the quiet desperation that led his father to a bottle, and then to the cold waters of the bay. Leland traced the lines with a calloused finger, each touch a fresh wound. He wasn't just a man in a dusty office. He was the custodian of a ghost, a legacy. This town was built on Croft sweat and Croft timber. Now, it was being sold off, piece by piece, to outsiders, people who didn't understand the history, people who didn't respect the sacrifice, People like Freeman, Leland's business. Croft Land Management was a name grander than its reality. It was a two-man operation run out of a room that was more storage closet than office. The filing cabinets were filled with files on the town's most vulnerable. An elderly widow, whose fence was supposedly 2 inches over the property line, a young couple from Seattle who didn't understand the complex local zoning codes. He was their self-appointed homeowners association HOA. A predator disguised as a bureaucrat. He'd create violations, file complaints, and then offer to mediate the problem for a fee. Or better yet, an offer to buy their land at a fraction of its worth. It was a slow, ugly process of reclaiming what he believed was stolen from him. And Malachi Freeman, he was the ultimate insult. He was the only black man to own a prime piece of waterfront property in Port Salvation. To Leland, it was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Freeman's quiet dignity felt like a judgment. Driving him out wasn't just business. It was a crusade, a symbolic victory to prove that the Croft name still meant something in this town. The jingle of a bell downstairs signaled the sheriff's office was open. Malachi Freeman walked in. His movements, economical and deliberate. The office was small, smelling of pine-scented cleaner and old files. Sheriff Elias Thorne looked up from his desk. He was a man etched by time and the damp Washington air, his face a roadmap of worry and kindness. "Mal," Thorne said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't stand on ceremony. "Elias," Mal replied. Thorne gestured to a worn wooden chair. "Heard you had some visitors." You could say that. The sheriff leaned back, the leather of his chair groaning in protest. Leland Croft thinks he's king of this town. Thinks because his granddaddy cut down all the trees. He owns the land forever. Mal just watched him. Waiting. Thorne aside, his gaze softening. "I need to tell you something. Mal, something I probably should have told you when you first got here. My sister, she was Marcus Vance's mother. That makes him my nephew." The air in the room grew heavy with unspoken history. The name hung between them. A ghost they both knew intimately. Mal's jaw tightened. A barely perceptible muscle twitching. "I know why you're here." Thorne continued gently. "And I know why you keep to yourself. But you need to understand something. The Croft family, their roots in this town are like hemlock. They grow deep, and they poison everything they touch. His cousin, Cade, is my deputy. He's got friends on the town council. You're not just fighting one angry man. Mal, you're fighting this town's memory of itself." Mal nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the warning. He didn't want this fight. He had come here to lay his own ghosts to rest, not to stir up new ones. He thanked the sheriff and walked out into the gray. Misty morning. Back in his workshop, the scent of cedar and sea salt was a small comfort. The half-finished canoe on its stands was a testament to a life he was trying to build. A life of quiet creation. But the war had followed him home. It always did. He walked over to a heavy wooden footlocker in the corner. The same one he'd carried through a dozen countries. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst neatly folded uniforms and old maps, was a small, velvet-lined box. He opened it. Marcus Vance's medals lay inside, gleaming softly in the dim light. A silver star, a purple heart, tokens of a life given too soon. Beside them was a faded photograph of the team. Young men with old eyes, grinning in the Afghan sun. Marcus was beside him, an arm slung over his shoulder. Mal picked up the silver star. It was cold and heavy in his palm. He had run from this. He had hidden from Nora, from his duty to his friend's memory, because the guilt was a weight too heavy to carry. But Leland Croft had changed the equation. Hiding wasn't honoring Marcus's sacrifice. It was letting men like Croft win. It was letting them poison the very ground Marcus had fought to protect. He closed his hand around the metal, its sharp edges pressing into his skin. He didn't want to be a soldier anymore. But some things, Some things you don't get to leave behind. The Harbor Light. In a town as small as Port Salvation, stories have a life of their own. They breathe, they grow, and they change shape with every telling. The tale of the confrontation at the boat workshop was no exception. It shed its skin of truth, a shakedown gone wrong, and grew a new one. Scaled with suspicion, the whispers started subtly. That Freeman fella? He has a temper. Then, they sharpened. Heard he put his hands on one of Croft's men. Over some property rules, it was the quiet language of exclusion. The town's ingrained, almost unconscious racial bias began to show itself, not in shouts, but in silence, in the way the mailman no longer waved, in the way fishermen mending their nets would suddenly find their work fascinating whenever Mal drove past. Malachi Freeman, the man who had sought invisibility, was now uncomfortably visible. A problem, a disruption, for a week. Mal made the workshop his entire world. The rhythmic scrape of sandpaper on cedar was his conversation. The cry of gulls was his music. But the coffee ran out. The emptiness of the space began to feel less like peace and more like a prison. He needed supplies. He needed to face the town. The Harbor Light Cafe was the town's heart. Its windows were a frame for the ever-changing painting of the sea and sky. The smell of brewing coffee and old wood was the scent of home for most. When Mal pushed open the heavy oak door, a small brass bell announced his arrival. The low murmur of morning gossip didn't just falter. It ceased, as if a switch had been flipped, and then he saw her. Nora Vance stood behind the long wooden counter, a polishing cloth still in her hand. A decade had passed, but time had been kind, carving strength into her features where it might have etched sorrow into others. The silver streaks in her dark hair caught the morning light. She was still, and in her stillness, she was the anchor of the room. Their eyes locked. 10 years of unspoken words, of a promise made and a message undelivered, lay between them like a vast, empty ocean. In her gaze, he saw the question she had every right to ask. Where were you? Mal, in his, she saw an apology so profound it had no words, a pain that had kept him away. He made the long walk to the counter, his steps echoing slightly in the sudden silence. He felt every stare on his back. A familiar sensation from a different life, a life where watchful eyes meant danger. Malachi, she said. Her voice was calm, measured, the perfect tone of a business owner addressing a customer. Only he could hear the tremor beneath it. Nora, he answered, his own voice gravelly. The space between them was charged with everything left unsaid. He opened his mouth, wanting to start, to explain. But the words were foreign objects, too heavy to lift. Just coffee, he finally said. Black. For here? She asked. The simple question felt monumental. Are you staying this time? Are you finally going to face this? Yes, he said. The word, a small stone, dropped into the deep well of their history. Here. M. As she reached for a mug, the brass bell rang again. Sharper this time. Deputy Cade Croft stepped inside, his presence filling the doorway. He was Leland Croft's blood, and he carried the same air of entitled ownership of the town. His eyes scanned the room and settled on Mal with pointed deliberation. Freeman. Cade's voice was a clean slice through the quiet. That truck of yours, it's parked mighty close to the fire hydrant. Mal glanced out the window. His truck was a good 15 feet from it. It's a legal spot. Deputy. This town has its own way of doing things, Cade said. Walking closer, his hand rested casually on his belt. Think of it as our own little homeowners association, HOA. We have rules for folks to ensure the character of our community is maintained. The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. You are not the right character. You don't fit. I'll need to see your license and registration. With the whole room as his audience, Mal slowly produced his documents. It was a power play, a public marking of his territory as an outsider. Nora stood motionless, her knuckles white around the coffee pot. This wasn't law enforcement. This was harassment. Cade took his time inspecting the papers before handing them back. He gave Mal a final, dismissive look. Just a friendly reminder. Drive safe. He strode out, the bell marking his departure. The cafe remained quiet for a beat longer, the tension slow to dissipate. Nora placed the heavy ceramic mug on the counter in front of Mal. Their fingers didn't touch. He paid, leaving a folded bill that was more than enough, and took his coffee to a booth in the far corner. He sat facing the door, a reflex he'd never lose. Through the window, he watched the fog begin to burn off the water. He had navigated minefields and survived ambushes. But this quiet, suffocating pressure from a town that had already judged him felt like a different kind of war. A war he was fighting without a weapon, without a map, and utterly alone. Malachi Freeman survived wars on the other side of the world, but now he's losing a silent one right here at home. Should he continue to fight alone to protect his promise? Or should he seek help from the one woman he's spent a decade avoiding? Is his silence a burden or a shield? Let us know what you think in the comments below. A wolf's allegiance. Deputy Cadecroft's world had shrunk to the size of a hospital bill. He sat at his small kitchen table, the early morning light filtering through the window, illuminating the stark numbers on the paper in front of him. A single sheet of paper, but it felt heavier than his badge, heavier than his gun. It was the latest invoice from the oncology clinic in Seattle for his daughter, Maya, a sum that made his stomach clench. He wasn't a bad man. He knew that, deep down, he had become a cop to help people, to uphold the law in the town his family had helped build. But the law didn't pay for experimental treatments. The law didn't stop the quiet terror that crept in late at night. The fear of losing his little girl. He looked at an old, framed photograph on the wall. A group of men, proud and weathered, standing in front of the Croft sawmill in its heyday. His father, his grandfather, and his uncle, Leland, who had stepped in after Cade's father passed. Leland, who had always been more of a father figure to him than a distant uncle. The sound of an engine pulled him from his thoughts. Leland's truck was pulling into his driveway. Leland didn't knock. He walked in like he owned the place, a habit born from a lifetime of believing he did. He placed a thick, white envelope on the table next to the medical bill. For Maya, Leland said, his voice softer than usual, "Don't argue. It's what family does." Cade stared at the envelope. He didn't have to open it to know it contained more money than he'd see in 6 months. It was a lifeline. It was a leash. "I can't take this." "Lee," Cade said, his voice strained. "You can, and you will," Leland replied, his tone shifting from familial concern to quiet command. "We're family. Cade, we look out for our own, and right now, our family is being threatened." Leland began to pace the small kitchen, his presence filling the room. "This Freeman character, he's a problem. He's got thorn wrapped around his finger. People are starting to talk. It makes us look weak." He paused and looked directly at Cade. "I need you to be my eyes and ears inside that office. I need you to enforce the real laws of this town, the ones that protect our way of life, the unwritten rules. Think of it as our own HOA. We need to make things uncomfortable for Mr. Freeman, a citation for an unpermitted dock, a complaint about noise from his workshop. Small things, legal things, just enough to remind him that he's a guest here, not a landowner." The request hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. It was a direct order to abuse his power, to harass a man he knew was innocent. All for family, for Maya. The money on the table felt like it was burning a hole through the wood. Meanwhile, Leland Croft was fighting a war on 2 fronts. The one against Malachi Freeman was for pride. The other was for survival. Later that day, he sat in his own truck, parked at a scenic overlook. The phone pressed hard against his ear. The voice on the other end was smooth, corporate, and utterly without sympathy. It belonged to a Mr. Sterling, a senior partner at a Seattle-based real estate conglomerate. The 90-day option on your outstanding loans is expiring. Leland, Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension. Our board was under the impression you would have consolidated the waterfront parcels by now. Specifically, the Freeman property. Leland's knuckles were white. He was leveraged to the hilt. He had used the promise of a luxury resort development to secure loans he couldn't possibly repay. The story he told the town about preserving a legacy was a lie he told himself to sleep at night. The truth was colder, sharper. He was desperate. If he didn't acquire Mal's land and sell the entire package to Sterling's firm, he wouldn't just lose his legacy, he'd lose everything. His ruthlessness wasn't born from strength, but from the terror of utter ruin. The next morning, Sheriff Thorne called Cade into his office. He closed the door. A rare and ominous gesture. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse it. He simply slid a thin, dusty file across his desk. Ever seen this? Thorne asked. Cade opened it. Inside were half a dozen old complaints filed against Leland Croft over the years. Allegations of intimidation. Unofficial evictions. All of them marked case closed, insufficient evidence, all of them investigated by the previous sheriff. A man who had been a close friend of Leland's father. Funny thing about this town. Cade, Thorne said, his eyes locking onto his deputy's. It has a long memory, but it's selective about what it chooses to remember. Those files, they're about choices. About which side of the line you stand on when things get tough. A man's got to decide what his badge really stands for. Is it for the law, or is it just for his family? Cracks in the armor. The assault came not with a bang, but with the rustle of official paper. It was a war of 1,000 cuts, each one delivered with the cold, impersonal precision of bureaucracy. Leland Croft, having failed with brute force, now employed the insidious tactics of a weaponized homeowners association, HOA. He was using the town's own rules as his weapon, and Cade was his willing soldier. First, it was Nora, affaire inspecteur, a man no one had seen before. He appeared at the harbor light during the morning rush. He moved with a grim purpose, his clipboard a catalog of doom. He found a litany of minor infractions, an extension cord that was a foot too long, a fire extinguisher that was an inch too low on the wall. The violations were trivial, the kind that usually earned a friendly warning. Nora was handed a fine so large it made her hands tremble. It was a punishment, not a citation. Then, it was Mal. A formal summons was delivered to his workshop by a grim-faced courier. It was from the county court. A civil complaint filed against him for the unauthorized construction of a marine pier. The pier was the small wooden dock that had been there for 50 years. The one he'd only replaced a few rotting planks on. The document was dense with legal jargon, full of subsections and clauses, designed to intimidate and confuse. It read like a declaration of war written by a lawyer. It felt like a notice from some phantom con-shot HOA. An invisible authority that had already declared him guilty. Nora Vance was no fool. She stood in her empty cafe after closing, staring at the fine. This wasn't random. This wasn't bad luck. This was a pattern. The troubles had started the moment Malachi Freeman had reappeared in her life. She felt a surge of anger. Hot and sharp. Anger at the town, at the Crofts, and a complicated, questioning anger at Mal himself. She didn't blame him. Not really, but his presence had stirred the town's murky depths, and now she was being pulled into the current. She found herself looking across the dark water toward his workshop, wondering about the quiet, haunted man who had brought the storm with him. Malachi stood on his small wooden dock, the summons in his hand. The paper felt heavy, weighted with the full power of a system that was being turned against him. He could take it. He had endured far worse. He had been hunted, shot at, and left for dead. A piece of paper was nothing. He could weather this storm, just as he had weathered everything else, alone, in silence. But then, he looked up, across the cove. He saw the familiar shape of Deputy Cade Croft's patrol car parked in front of the harbor light. Cade got out, not with the urgency of an officer responding to a call, but with the slow, deliberate swagger of a man marking his territory. He walked to Nora's front door and, with a practiced motion, taped a bright orange piece of paper to the glass. A notice of violation. And in that moment, something inside Malachi snapped. It wasn't a loud crack, but a deep, seismic shift. The carefully constructed walls of his isolation, built over a decade with bricks of guilt and mortar of grief, crumbled to dust. The rage he had buried in the frozen mountains of Afghanistan, the fury he had suppressed for 10 long years, surged to the surface. It was a clean, righteous anger. Marcus Vance hadn't died in the dirt, thousands of miles from home, so his wife could be terrorized by a petty tyrant and his uniformed errand boy. He hadn't given his last breath entrusting her to Mal's care, only for Mal to stand by and watch her be broken down. Piece by piece, his silence, he realized with sickening clarity, was not a shield to protect her. It was a form of cowardice. It was a betrayal. He turned without another thought. The summons fluttered from his hand. Forgotten. Landing silently on the wooden planks, he walked to the water's edge, where his newest creation, a sleek Chadar kayak, rested. It was a vessel of peace. Built for quiet journeys on calm waters, he pushed it into the cove. The motion was fluid, economical, the muscle memory of 100 nighttime insertions taking over. He slipped into the cockpit, grabbed the paddle, and with a powerful, deep stroke, he pointed the bow of the boat not away from his past, but directly toward it. He paddled, each stroke a silent vow. He was no longer just a man with a secret, hiding in the shadows. He was a promise keeper. He aimed for the single, warm beacon of the harbor light, a steady glow in the coming twilight. He was crossing the water to face the woman he'd abandoned, to start a war he never wanted, and, finally, to deliver a message 10 years too late. An uneasy alliance. The decision was made of water and wood. Mal pushed the kayak he'd built, the Wanderer, into the calm, gray waters of the bay. Each paddle stroke was a deliberate movement away from the island of his self-imposed exile and toward the mainland of his past. The lights of the Harbor Light Cafe grew brighter, a beacon he had observed from a distance for years, but never dared approach. Tonight, there was no other choice. Nora Vance was sweeping the wooden porch of the cafe. The rhythmic scrape of the broom against the planks, the only sound in the evening quiet. She paused, sensing a change in the air before she saw him. The dark shape of the kayak gliding silently to the shore. A man emerging from the mist. Malachi. He pulled the boat onto the pebbled beach, his movements sure and economical. There was nowhere to hide. The entire town was a stage, and for this one moment, they were the only two actors on it. He walked toward her, and a decade of silence stretched between them, taut and heavy. "Malachi," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the storm of emotions inside her. "Of all the years, and all the nights, you pick this one." He stopped a few feet from the steps, the worn wooden handle of a paddle still in his hand. He looked tired, older than she remembered. "Nora." "Why now?" she asked, her voice cutting through the pleasantries. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, raw and 10 years in the making. After all this time, why now? He looked down at his hands, then back at her. The carefully constructed walls of his solitude began to crumble. There were no excuses, no explanations that could possibly fill the void of a decade. "I couldn't," he said, his voice raspy with disuse. Marcus, his last words. I couldn't bring them to you. I failed him, and I was ashamed. He took a breath, the confession costing him more than any physical exertion. I'm sorry, Nora, for all of it. He then told her everything. Not about Afghanistan, not yet, but about the here and now. About Leland Croft and his fake HOA police. About the citations. The harassment. The calculated campaign to drive him off his land. And how. Now. That campaign was turning on her. Nora listened. Her expression unreadable. She was a practical woman, forged by grief and the daily grind of running a small business. She understood threats. She understood survival. As he spoke, the hurt in her eyes was slowly replaced by a familiar, steely resolve. The resolve of a woman who had lost too much to be pushed around by a bully. She leaned the broom against the railing. Get in here, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. You look like you could use a real cup of coffee. She unlocked the door and flipped on a single light inside the cafe. The room was warm, filled with the comforting smell of coffee grounds and baked bread. It was a world away from Mal's Spartan workshop. It was a home. They sat at a small table in the back. The rest of the cafe shrouded in shadow. For the first time, they truly talked. Nora, with her intimate knowledge of the town's undercurrents, connected the dots. She told him about the other small landowners who had been mysteriously bought out. She spoke of the Crofts' deep-seated influence, how they operated as a shadow government, a corrupt homeowners association HOA for the entire town, enforcing their own rules with fear. Leland doesn't just want your land. Mal, she said, air voice low. He wants to erase you. He wants to prove that people like you, people from the outside, don't belong here, that he still holds the power. Mal listened, realizing the fight was bigger than he had imagined. His skills were for direct confrontation, for assessing physical threats. But this was a different kind of war, fought with whispers, rumors, and the slow poison of bureaucracy. He couldn't win it alone. I need your help, Nora, he said. It was the hardest thing he'd said all night. An admission that he couldn't protect her from a distance, that he couldn't do it by himself. You know these people. You hear things. I can track Croft. I can find out what he's planning. But I need to know where to look. Nora looked at him across the table. At this man who was a living ghost from her past. Helping him meant stepping into the line of fire. It meant reopening old wounds. But looking at him, she didn't just see a soldier. She saw the man her husband had trusted with his life. Okay, Mal, she said, a flicker of the old fire returning to her eyes. Let's give the bastard a fight. For the first time in 10 years, Malachi Freeman wasn't fighting for a memory. He was fighting alongside a living, breathing person, and in the quiet warmth of the closed cafe, a fragile, uneasy alliance was forged in the shadow of a shared loss. Digging in the past, they became a two-person insurgency, waging a quiet war in the shadows of Port Salvation. They had no weapons, only patience, no army, only each other. Malachi's role was one he knew by heart, intelligence gathering. The man who had sought invisibility now used it as his greatest asset. He became a ghost. He would park his old truck on a logging road overlooking the town, a pair of powerful binoculars resting on the dashboard. From there, he watched the shabby office of Leland Croft. He photographed the expensive cars with Seattle license plates that arrived after dark. He noted the times. He documented the faces. He was methodical, his movements economical, his mind clear. He operated on instinct honed in places where a single mistake meant death. Here, the stakes were different, but the focus was the same. Nora's battlefield was the harbor light. Her weapon was a coffee pot and a sympathetic ear. Her cafe was the town's confessional. As she refilled mugs and wiped down the counter, she listened. She heard the story of a fisherman whose dock fees had suddenly tripled. A notice delivered by a man matching the description of one of Croft's thugs. She heard from an old widow whose property line was being disputed. The official-looking papers citing obscure HOA regulations that had never existed before. The town was bleeding from 1,000 small cuts. And Nora collected the stories, each one a piece of a larger, uglier puzzle. They were no longer just whispers. They were testimonies. Every night, after she had locked the cafe door, she would leave the backlight on. It was a signal. Soon after, the silent shape of Mal's kayak would glide across the dark water. He would slip into the back of the cafe, bringing the scent of salt water and cold night air with him. They would sit at a small table. The day's intelligence spread between them. His photographs, hair handwritten notes, a black sedan, Washington plates. He'd say, his voice low, stayed for 2 hours. The man who got out was carrying a briefcase. Agnes Miller told me they offered to buy her farm today. Nora would counter, for half of what it's worth. They told her the Conshat HOA would condemn it for code violations if she didn't sell. Through these hushed conversations about their investigation, the wall between them began to crack. The past, which had been a locked room, slowly opened. One night, Nora spoke of Marcus. Not the soldier, but the man. The way he used to hum off-key when he was fixing things, the terrible jokes he used to tell, and for the first time, Mal spoke of him too. He told her about a time in training when Marcus had replaced the salt in the shakers with sugar right before a visit from a commanding officer. A small story, a human story. As he spoke, a genuine, unburdened smile touched his lips. And in that moment, Nora saw the man Marcus had loved like a brother. The wounds, still raw after a decade, began to feel the first touch of healing. But they were not the only ones watching. Leland and Cade Croft were not fools. They saw Nora's cafe becoming a hub for the discontented. They saw the new purpose in Malachi's eyes. They saw the alliance, and they pushed back. The harassment was no longer veiled in bureaucracy. It became personal, vicious. One morning, Mal arrived at his workshop to find the beautiful, nearly finished kayak he'd been working on split in two. A jagged wound hacked into the cedar by an axe. There was no note. None was needed. The message was clear. We can destroy what you create. The next day, Nora found all 4 tires on her car slashed, the rubber gaping open like silent mouths. The message was just as clear. We can leave you stranded. Helpless. That night, they stood together in the cold, damp air outside her cafe. Looking at the damage, the streetlights cast long, lonely shadows. The town around them was asleep. Or perhaps, just pretending to be. They had poked the hornet's nest, and now the swarm was coming for them. The path ahead was no longer just difficult. It was dangerous. And they had no one to turn to but each other. There are only 2 of them against a system that has long been broken. But maybe 2 is enough. If you are still listening, please help me by commenting with the number 2 below, so I know that I still have friends journeying with me through this story. Your presence is the greatest encouragement for me to tell the final chapter of Malachi and Nora's story. Thank you. The Sheriff's Gambit. The file landed on Sheriff Elias Thorne's desk with a soft thud, but it felt as heavy as a tombstone. He looked at the 2 people sitting across from him. Malachi Freeman, a man built for war, now waging one with whispers and photographs, and Nora Vance, a woman who had rebuilt her life from ashes, now fanning the embers of a quiet rebellion. For an hour, he listened. He examined the grainy photos Mal had taken of Leland Croft meeting with a man whose license plate traced back to a shell corporation in Seattle. He read the handwritten statements Nora had collected from other residents, stories of intimidation, of sudden tax audits, of a relentless pressure campaign that felt like the worst kind of homeowners association HOA tyranny, but without any of the paperwork. He studied the financial documents Mal had acquired through a contact from his old life. Papers that painted a clear picture of Leland's desperation. The man wasn't building an empire. He was trying to plug a hole in a sinking ship. It was more than enough for Thorne to know the truth. But it wasn't enough for a conviction. It was all circumstantial. Leland's lawyers would tear it apart. Paint him as a victim of a town turning against a founding family. Thorne leaned back, the springs of his old chair groaning. He was 2 months from retirement. He could file the report. Let the next sheriff deal with the fallout. He could choose peace, but as he looked at Mal and Nora, he saw the ghost of his nephew. Marcus. He saw the town he loved being slowly choked by the roots of one bitter family. This wasn't just another case. This was his legacy. It's not enough to bring him in. Thorne said, his voice gravelly. He'll walk. We need him to confess. We need to catch him in the act. A plan began to form in the quiet office. A dangerous gamble built on Leland's own greed. He wants your land. Mal. Thorne said, his eyes fixed on him. So, you're going to give him what he wants. Or at least, make him think you are. The trap was simple, elegant, and fraught with risk. Mal would call Leland, pretending to be a broken man. He'd agree to sell, his one condition being that the deal had to be done in cash. And it had to be done at the old sawmill. Neutral ground. He'd say, though they all knew it was Leland's kingdom, Mal would be wearing a wire. Thorne and a trusted team would be hidden, waiting for the right moment. He won't just buy the land. Mal said, his voice low and certain. He'll want to gloat. He'll want to tell me why he won. And that's what we'll be waiting for. Thorne confirmed. The final piece of the puzzle was the most unpredictable. Cade. Thorne knew his deputy was compromised, caught between his badge and his bloodline. He couldn't trust him with the plan. But he couldn't leave him in the office either. Later that afternoon, he called Cade in. He kept his expression neutral, his voice professional. Cade, I need you to handle something for me, Thorne said, sliding a folder across the desk. There's been a series of break-ins up at the north end of the county. I want you to head up there. Talk to the residents. Set up a visible presence. It'll be an all-nighter. I need my best man on it. The praise was a subtle test. He was giving Cade a way out. An alibi. An opportunity to be a good cop. Far away from his uncle's dirty work. He was giving him a chance to choose his allegiance without having to make a direct stand. Cade took the folder, his face a mask of professionalism. But his eyes betrayed him. There was a flicker of suspicion. A flash of conflict. He knew the break-ins were minor. He knew sending him away for the entire night was unusual. He could smell that something was happening. Something big. Yes. Sheriff, Cade said, his voice tight. I'll head out right away. He walked out of the office, the folder in his hand. Thorne watched him go, a knot tightening in his stomach. The entire operation, Mal's safety, the future of the town, it all rested on a single thing. Fragile hope. That the good man he had hired years ago was still in there somewhere. Underneath the weight of family and fear, he had set all the pieces on the board. Now, all he could do was wait and see which way his own deputy would choose to fall. Salvation in the mist. The old sawmill was a skeleton picked clean by time and rust. It smelled of decay and resentment. Malachi Freeman walked into the cavernous main building, his steps echoing in the silence. Leland Croft was waiting for him, standing beside a massive, dormant saw blade. He looked like a king presiding over a dead kingdom. Freeman, Leland said, a triumphant smirk on his face. I knew you'd see reason. A man has to know his place. Mal placed the unsigned contract on a dusty table between them. The deal is, you leave Nora Vance and her business alone. Permanently. Leland laughed. A harsh, grating sound. You're in no position to make demands. Believing he had won, the dam of his self-control broke, and the poison poured out. This town has rules. It has a history. It was built by men like my father, not by people like you. You come here. You buy up our prettiest land. And you think you belong? He gestured wildly. This whole scheme, this HOA, it was to protect our heritage from outsiders who don't understand sacrifice. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Unaware of the tiny microphone hidden in Mal's collar, I ran this town. The permits, the fines, the so-called Kanshat HOA, that was all me. Making sure things stayed the way they're supposed to. He had admitted to everything. As Leland reached for a pen to sign the bogus contract, a new sound cut through the air. The crunch of boots on gravel. Deputy Cade Croft appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his service weapon drawn and held steady. But it wasn't pointed at Mal, it was pointed at his uncle. It's over. Uncle Cal, Cade said, his voice shaking but firm. Put your hands up. For a moment, Leland just stared, his face a mask of disbelief. Then betrayal. Cade, what are you doing? You're one of us. No, Cade said, a decade of suppressed integrity finding its voice. I'm a cop. That's when Leland snapped. With a primal roar of fury, he lunged it. Not at Mal, but at his own nephew. The two men crashed into a pile of old lumber. The gun skittered across the concrete floor. Mal didn't hesitate. He moved. Not with the explosive violence of a soldier, but with the controlled, precise force of a man ending a threat. There were no gunshots, no heroic one-liners. It was a grim, desperate struggle among the ghosts of dead machinery. A tangle of limbs, the grunt of exertion, the sharp crack of a bone. Mal used leverage and momentum. His movements, a brutal kind of physics. Subdued Leland, pinning him to the ground. His forearm pressed firmly against Croft's throat, ending the fight just as the wail of Sheriff Thorne's sirens grew deafeningly loud. Weeks later, the autumn mist over Port Salvation felt different, cleaner. Leland Croft and his men were gone, swallowed by the legal system they had tried to twist for their own gain. Cade Croft was on administrative leave, facing an internal investigation, but he had taken the first, hardest step toward redemption. The harbor light was quiet. The morning rush was over. Malachi sat at a small table across from Nora, a steaming mug of coffee between them. The awkward silence that had defined their relationship for so long was finally gone, replaced by a quiet comfort. He was finally telling her. He told her about the cold, about the thin air, about the chaos of the firefight. And he told her about Marcus's last moments. He wasn't scared. Mal said, his eyes focused on the memory. He just made me a promise. He finally looked at her. He said, Nora, tell her I tried. Oh. Tears welled in Nora's eyes and traced paths down her cheeks. They weren't the tears of fresh grief, but of a long overdue release, a final, painful, beautiful letting go. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Thank you, Malachi, she whispered, for bringing him home. Mal looked out the window of the cafe. Across the cove, to his small workshop, nestled among the tall cedars. For the first time, it didn't look like a hideout. It didn't look like a place of exile. It looked like a part of a landscape, a piece of a community. It looked like home. The ghost that had followed him from Afghanistan, the heavy cloak of guilt he had worn for a decade, was gone. He was no longer a shadow. He was Malachi Freeman, and he was free. In the quiet of the cove, between the scent of cedar and fresh brewed coffee, two people found their salvation not by forgetting the past, but by finally facing it together. What does it truly mean to find your way home? For 10 years, Malachi Freeman was a ghost, haunted by a promise he couldn't keep. But by finally facing the past he ran from and the woman he felt he had failed, he didn't just find justice, he found his own salvation. The quiet strength of one good person can remind an entire community of what is right. If you were moved by Malachi's journey, we would be honored to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if stories like this resonate with you, please consider subscribing to Dipu Cotter Stories to continue the journey with us. Thank you for being here and for sharing in this story.